If one were to ask about the greatest evacuation in history, probably the dates that would spring to mind are the 27th of May to the 4th of June 1940, when 338,226 Allied service personnel were pulled off the beaches at Dunkirk. Indeed, it was one of many evacuations performed by the British Expeditionary Forces, the BEF, or to give it the name of the time, back every fortnight. Wars are not won by evacuations, warned Churchill, and if they were, then that prize would have gone to the German military. The largest evacuation of all time was that of service personnel and the civilian population from the east, but unlike Dunkirk or the other British operations, it was not performed in the summer across comparatively small distances, but in the dead of winter across the near-frozen Baltic Sea, involving journeys of hundreds of kilometers, and it was hindered by the Nazi leadership, which put military transports above human lives. In this video, I shall outline the tragedy of the German population of East Prussia and its efforts to escape from the oncoming Red Army and the indifference of those in charge in the Nazi regime to their fate, which came about directly as a result of its war and its racial policies. The plan of Operation Hannibal, as it was called, is often portrayed by historians as being the evacuation of civilians from East Prussia. However, in my opinion, this is completely erroneous. The objective of Operation Hannibal was not to evacuate people, but that of military equipment, which could be repaired and used again, whilst leaving German civilians to their fate. Rather than a success of Grand Admiral Dönitz, it was, I think, the betrayal of hundreds of thousands of Germans by the Nazi regime, indifferent to their fate. I shall highlight this video with maps which may help you to understand what's going on, and photographs from the period as well as my videos. But as far as my videos are concerned, what I would like you to bear in mind that they were taken in the summer, and the events I am about to describe took place in the winter. In the first days of January 1945, a deceptive silence lay over the front between the Baltic Sea and the Carpathians. It was the calm before the storm, along a line stretching from the border of East Prussia through central Poland. As the bulk of the German armed forces had been frittered away in pointless assaults in the west, the Eastern Front was, as Lieutenant General Heinz Guderian told Hitler, a pack of cards waiting to collapse. On the 12th of January 1945, the attack came. The Red Army easily broke out of the bridgeheads on the Vistula and Narew rivers, and with a few days forced wide-ranging breakthroughs which took it through Poland and deep into the German heartlands. In the central sector, their formation smashed Army Group A, and at the end of January they were on the Oder near Küstrin, 60 kilometers from Berlin. In the early morning hours of the 31st of January 1945, advanced detachments of the Soviet 5th Shock Army and the 2nd Guards Tank Army crossed the Oder and formed a bridgehead on the western bank of the river around the village of Kienitz. East Prussia was surrounded on the 26th of January 1945 when Stalin's troops reached the Vistula Lagoon near Tolkemit, today Tolkmitsko. 3 days later, the siege ring around Königsberg, the historic capital of East Prussia, closed. Here, Army Group Center was split into 3 pockets. At Heilenbiel, today Marmanovo, at Königsberg, today Kaliningrad, and on the Samland Peninsula to the northwest of Königsberg. There were still German units in Pomerania and Danzig, West Prussia, but it was obvious that they too would soon be overrun. A major refugee crisis developed throughout eastern Germany, with probably around 5 million people trying to get to safety by the end of the month. Terrified by Goebbels' rhetoric about Red Army crimes, either real or imagined, the civilian population wanted to get out. The Nazi authorities did have some evacuation plans in place in the event of limited Soviet incursions, but those that existed had been rendered useless by the speed of the Red Army advance. In addition, Gauleiters like Erich Koch in East Prussia showed their total disregard for the population, calling for perseverance and withholding the evacuation orders for the general public whilst ensuring that their own escape routes were clear and open. But now there was no holding back. Women, children, and old men left everything behind and made their way west, whilst males aged from 16 to 60 were forced into the Volkssturm, the Nazi version of the Home Guard. It was an icy winter. At night, the thermometer could drop to -20 degrees. Thousands upon thousands, especially small children and old people, froze to death. Perhaps remembering how refugees had held up Allied movements in Belgium and France only 4.5 years earlier, Wehrmacht columns often brutally pushed these refugees out of the way into the drainage ditches beside the roads and ordered them to keep off the thoroughfares in order to maintain military freedom of movement. Terrible things awaited those who stayed behind or who never even got out of their villages. Soviet soldiers shot anyone who did not suit them. They plundered, raped, and burned down entire towns. Visiting the area of former East Prussia today, one can still see the damage that old towns, even large ones, were put to the torch. This was the expected revenge for the pointless destruction fought in the racist war of annihilation that Hitler and the Nazis had brought to the peoples of the East. Revenge with bestial fury for all the murder and horror that German soldiers brought to the Soviet Union in a war unprecedented in modern European history. On the 20th of January 1945, the Great Escape from East Prussia began. Following the Red Army encirclement, the only way out was via the Baltic Sea. The commander-in-chief of the Fourth Army, General Friedrich Hossbach, almost blocked all escape routes for the East Prussians when he wanted to break through to the west towards the Vistula with his surrounded units. The civilian population has to stay behind. That sounds cruel, but it can't be changed, he had told his commanders. However, since Hitler sacked him and ordered the Fourth Army not to retreat a meter, the people had the chance to flee. Hitler coming to the rescue of the German civilians? Not at all. The Führer and his military, with their orders to hold out, were not concerned with the threatened people, but with the fight for victory or destruction. The German people are now going through the test of their worth, and they must pass it if they don't want to lose their national existence at all. This is how Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels described Hitler's position on the refugee catastrophe in his diary on the 20th of January 1945 from the comfort and warmth of his luxury villa. This photograph shows refugees in the port of Pillau on the 26th of January 1945. This small port was to remain choked with people trying to escape for the next 3.5 months. Further to the west, at the other side of East Prussia, there were similar scenes. Attacked by low-flying Soviet aircraft, refugees fled across the frozen Vistula Lagoon towards the Vistula Spit, a peninsula bordered by the Vistula Lagoon on one side and the Baltic Sea on the other. I find the Vistula Spit to be one of the most attractive places I have ever been to. And if you ever see my tourist site on YouTube, you'll see there's lots of videos from there. One can drive through the forest, and in between breaks in the trees, there's the murky blue of the Baltic to one side and the blue-green of the Vistula lagoon on the other. Even in winter it has its charm, but not for the panicked refugees who would have had to cross the ice to get there, knowing that if it cracked, then they would be doomed. Once across the Spit, then they could hope for a land connection to the west, to the Danzig area, today Gdansk. In the north, some moved to Pilau, today Bałtysk, the port town 50 kilometers from Königsberg, in the hope of getting out by ship. Since many Königsbergers fled there before the Red Army had completely surrounded their city on the 29th of January 1945, tens of thousands crowded with the 12,000 inhabitants of the town at the end of January. Chaos was reigning in the Danzig area too. Hundreds of thousands were waiting there for escape ships, which may or may not come. After the war, the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, boasted that 2 million people owed their lives to him personally. Rescuing people from the East German provinces was a priority in the spring of 1945, he repeated in many interviews he gave. Many believed him, including the organization of people who had once lived in East Prussia, which treated him as a hero. However, it's not true. Indeed, it is perhaps the reverse of the truth. The proof was then available if anyone had looked for it in the war diary of the Naval War Staff. On the 22nd of January 1945, the Führer, Adolf Hitler, agreed to Dönitz's suggestion that the Navy's scarce coal reserves be allocated for military tasks alone, not for the removal of refugees. On the 23rd of January 1945, Dönitz radioed a message to Gdynia in occupied Poland to begin evacuations to ports outside of the Soviet area of operations. I think his later claims of trying to help the population of East Prussia to escape is based on this radio message. However, evacuations were to be of the wounded military personnel and equipment. Not a word was said about getting refugees out. The aim was to do everything possible to ensure that the surrounded troops could continue fighting. This included the army in the Courland Peninsula in Latvia, part of what had been Army Group North, which was supposed to hold out, although the front had passed it by many months earlier. It held out until the 8th of May 1945. Above all, however, the Grand Admiral wanted to secure control of the eastern Baltic Sea as a training area for the new submarine types. Dönitz, no less certain of final victory than his Führer, believed that with this miracle weapon he could still force a turn in the naval war against the West. Therefore, tens of thousands of people died because of his fanciful belief that a training area for a new submarine could change the course of the conflict. Thus, in the spring of 1945, all Baltic shipping was subordinated to military objectives, continuing the fight in the surrounded pockets of Courland, East Prussia and Danzig. Dönitz made sure that this slaughter continued. The Kriegsmarine continued to bring ammunition and supplies to the shrinking pockets until the beginning of May, despite the shortage of it in other areas. On the way back, the ships took more than 500,000 wounded, a horrible indication of the brutality of the fighting. In addition, up to the last few weeks, the Navy had been transporting weapons and vehicles that were damaged with no hope of repair in the West, taking up space that could have been given to refugees. Even civilian ships were increasingly denied to the waiting people. The Hamburg Gauleiter and Reich Commissar for Maritime Shipping, Karl Kaufmann, stated succinctly that the requirements of Army Group North for supplies and returning equipment largely claimed all my Baltic Sea tonnage. Nonetheless, as early as January 1945, the Baltic Sea Naval Command had used its large Hapag-Lloyd steamers, such as the Hamburg, Deutschland and the Pretoria, to evacuate refugees. Terrible tragedies occurred. On the 30th of January 1945, a Soviet submarine torpedoed the Wilhelm Gustloff, a steamer operated by the Nazi travel organization Kraftfreude. Within minutes, the ship sank in the icy sea. The number of victims is not known, but in all probability it was the worst maritime disaster in history, with between 5,000 and 9,000 people being killed. As no one was counting the number of people on the ship after a certain point, then the real numbers are just not known. On the 16th of April 1945, the Goya met the same fate. Once more, the numbers are not known, but it is assumed that around 7,000 people died. I have done separate videos on both of these ships. Thousands also drowned in the sinking of the Karlsruhe, Steuben, Mulkefels and other ships. In this way, up to 20,000 people died in the Baltic Sea in the spring of 1945. Some of the evacuees ended up in the Baltic Sea ports and in German-occupied Denmark, but most of them just made it from Pillau to Danzig and Gdynia. From there, onward transport was slow. The Wehrmacht had confiscated all railway capacity for itself. Finally, in mid-February, 500,000 refugees thronged the Danzig area. It is estimated that up to 100 people died here every day from hunger, cold and exhaustion. The best these refugees could hope for was evacuation to Hell, and from there another ship further to the west. Maybe as many as 265,000 people did make it from Danzig to Hell, something today boat trips offer various times a day. Indeed, today a boat trip is the quickest route from Gdansk to Hell. In Pomerania, Gauleiter Albert Foster initially had 7,000 people on the move per day. Later, this was moved to between 15 and 20,000. But with the next offensive, which began on the 24th of February 1945, the Red Army overran Pomerania. When the Red Army reached the Baltic Sea near Kirchlin, today Koszalin, on the 4th of March 1945, those to the east were also cut off in another huge pocket. Those who could fled back east. A report from the staff of the Second Army reflects how much the desperate people have become victims of the Nazi leadership. There are around 2 million people in the area of Danzig. Regrettably, the population was transported west and then east again. The misery is unbelievable because the population has to be ruthlessly pushed off the roads by the withdrawing troops in agreement with the local authorities and stay where they are. When the Wehrmacht on the 19th to the 20th of February 1945 succeeded in breaking the siege ring around Königsberg, thousands upon thousands fled from the city to Pillau and the surrounding fishing villages. Gauleiter Koch expected more than 250,000 refugees and demanded the immediate evacuation of 20,000 people a day. However, the head of transport responsible, Rear Admiral Konrad Engelhardt, informed him that the coal quotas were not sufficient and therefore could not transport more than 5,000 people per day. Furthermore, due to a lack of ships, the refugees could not be taken to Schleswig-Holstein, Denmark or Mecklenburg, but only to Gdynia or Danzig. From there, the Navy hoped that they would get ships to take them further, although of course in most cases this did not happen. At the beginning of March, at least 135,000 refugees were crammed up in the area of Pillau due to the shortage of shipping space. Much further to the west in early March, a task force composed of the German cruiser Admiral Scheer, accompanied by 3 destroyers and the Elbling-class torpedo boat T-36, were giving cover to the German pocket near Wollin. During that operation, naval small craft evacuated over 75,000 soldiers and civilians who had been isolated there. They were taken to larger warships and other transports lying offshore. While a number of these transports were sunk, large liners such as the SS Deutschland got through and carried up to 11,000 soldiers and civilians each. On the 23rd of March 1945, the Red Army launched a major attack on Danzig. Much too late, the Commander-in-Chief of Army Group North, Walter Weiss, appealed to Dönitz. Send ships, equipment and vehicles. On the 30th of March 1945, as the beautiful Gothic port of Danzig was in flames, Grand Admiral Dönitz replied that all possibilities are being exhausted, showing once again how little he cared about the fate of the refugees and soldiers. When determining the scarce reserves of coal, he again put all military transports as a priority above that of the evacuation of the wounded and refugees. Just a few days later, the large passenger ships which had been used to transport refugees and the wounded had finally been stopped due to a lack of fuel, although were still stockpiles available to the military. By the end of March 1945, the Red Army had conquered the pockets of Danzig and Heiligenbühl. Nonetheless, there were still 400,000 civilians in the last areas held by the Wehrmacht, in addition to tens of thousands of wounded, 150,000 of them in the region of the Vistula estuary and Hell Peninsula, as well as 250,000 in Pillau, Königsberg and Samland. Gauleiter Koch again asked for the evacuation as soon as possible, and Dönitz again assured that the best possible would be done. Nothing happened. On the 6th of April 1945, when the Red Army began to storm Königsberg, where more than 70,000 civilians were still present, the distribution of the ship transports from East Prussia was determined to be 40% for the wounded, 20% for civilians, and 40% for military purposes. That is, only a fifth of the ship's capacity was intended for the refugees. On the 9th of April 1945, after Königsberg had surrendered, the proportion of civilians was increased from 20 to 40% at the expense of the wounded. 40% was still reserved for the removal of weapons, vehicles and other equipment for the final battle further to the west in the heart of the Reich. In mid-April 1945, Samland was occupied. Only Pillau remained. From there, 20,000 wounded and several thousand refugees had been brought to Hell since the beginning of April. But when the Red Army advanced on the port, there were still 85,000 people there. Pillau fell on the 25th of April 1945. No one knows how many of those people survived. However, despite the plight of the German refugees, the Nazis kept their priorities straight. On the same day that Pillau fell, the evacuation of the Stutthof concentration camp near the Vistula estuary began by sea. Weeks earlier, when the Wilhelm Gustloff had been sunk, the SS had murdered thousands of Jews in revenge for the loss of the cruise liner. This had taken place at Palnikin, today Yantane, in the Kaliningrad region of Russia. Another 3,300 prisoners were being deported to Neustadt in the Bay of Lübeck in ships and barges. Most did not live to see liberation. A third of them were killed en route, mainly from attacks by British bombers which mistook the ships for troop transports. The surviving prisoners were murdered by the SS. As Adolf Hitler committed suicide in the Berlin bunker on the 30th of April 1945, around 250,000 refugees and soldiers crowded together on the Hell Peninsula and near the Vistula estuary. Indescribable scenes played out. People stormed the few ships that were still sailing west. Only now, in his radio speech of the 1st of May 1945, did Dönitz make a tactical turn. Under the slogan, to save German people from being annihilated by Bolshevism, he called for the struggle to be continued in the East in order to protect the population and soldiers from enslavement and annihilation. And only on the 6th of May 1945, 2 days before the capitulation, did he give the highest priority to saving the people for the first time. He released all remaining U-boat fuel reserves for refugee traffic and ordered that all ships available were to be sent to the Hell Peninsula and Courland. In 2 days in May, 110,000 soldiers, 6,300 wounded, and 5,400 refugees were shipped west across the Baltic Sea. On the day of the capitulation, there were still around 150,000 Wehrmacht soldiers and 50,000 refugees near the Vistula estuary and on the Hel Peninsula. There were a few thousand soldiers on the Vistula spit and 180,000 in Courland. At 2100 hours on the 8th of May 1945, the last day of war, a convoy consisting of 92 large and small vessels left the Latvian city of Liepāja with 18,000 soldiers and civilians. While several hundred of those who boarded small ships on this, the last day of war, were captured by Soviet motor torpedo boats, evacuation to the west continued for at least a week after all such movements were prohibited by the terms of the German surrender. To put this in context, over 120,000 people were pulled out in 2 days in May. Had the military not had the priority in evacuating equipment, which often was of next to no use, then far more people could have been saved. In total, only around 900,000 refugees managed to reach the west by sea, although many more were taken from East Prussia to the Danzig area, only to fall into the hands of the Red Army there. 3 to 4 million Germans in East Prussia, Danzig and Pomerania came under the control of the Red Army. Almost all of them were expelled from their homes by the late 1940s. However, those who were rescued in 1945 did not owe their luck to the Navy leadership, but to courageous individuals, whether in Wehrmacht or party uniforms, who often acted against orders to give priority to military equipment transports or to push a few more refugees onto the ships. Nevertheless, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz continued to claim until his death in 1980 that we were doing everything we could that was possible in the situation at the time to save German people. Karl Dönitz repeatedly stated in numerous post-war publications and other statements that his main focus in the last months of the war was the evacuation of the refugees. This claim remained unchallenged for a long time. The East Prussian Landmannschaft, the organization of the former inhabitants of the region, awarded him their Prussian Shield, and the former Commander-in-Chief of the Navy was dubbed the Saviour of Millions. What is now clear is that the focus of Dönitz's thoughts and actions in the last months of the war regarding ship movements in the Baltic Sea was naval manoeuvring for military purposes and supplying Wehrmacht units fighting in the east. The Navy supplied the encircled areas with soldiers, ammunition, and war material until May and transported a total of 500,000 wounded on the way back, together with military supplies that, as I've already mentioned, was often useless in the West. Dönitz merely tolerated taking civilians with him, and only to the extent that military transports permitted. Not only was he following the orders laid down to him by Adolf Hitler, but also suggesting to him what those orders should be, and they were not to save German people. I hope you found this interesting. I'm very much attached to the area of northern Poland. Indeed, it's my favourite place, and I spend almost every summer here. I've done many other videos about the history of the area, such as a description of interwar sea travel in the Baltic. In that video, I mentioned many of the places that are in this video, although of course those were much happier times for the people who were living there. I upload at least one video a week, and if it's at least, it's at Friday at 2000 hours my time, which is Central European time. Thanks very much for watching.